John Parker's story began like many others in the middle-class neighborhoods of Indiana. Born in 1970, he grew up in a family that valued hard work and perseverance. While little is known about his early childhood, one thing became clear. John was determined to make something of himself. His entrepreneurial spirit surfaced early, and he constantly sought ways to achieve financial independence and self-improvement. After finishing high school, John embarked on his journey into the workforce. His first job was as a waiter's assistant at a local restaurant, but his time there was brief. The exact reasons for his departure remain unclear, though family members later noted his dissatisfaction with the job. Rather than letting this setback deter him, John redirected his energy into something that would shape the rest of his life: sales. This true crime story is filled with so many twists and turns. The revelations, as well as how the story actually turned out in the end, is unbelievable and will surely leave you stunned and absolutely shocked. John joined Kirby, a company specializing in vacuum cleaner sales, as a door-to-door salesman. At first, his family dismissed this career choice, skeptical that it would lead anywhere meaningful. But John had found his niche. Within a year, he rose to the top of his team, earning accolades for his sales achievements and becoming a mentor to other salespeople. His success wasn't accidental. John worked long hours, sometimes up to 16 hours a day, to perfect his craft and establish himself as a leader in his field. It was during this time that John's path crossed with Judy Parker. Judy, born in 1969 in Texas, came from a very different background. Raised in a low-income family, she grew up facing challenges that required her to mature quickly. At just 14, she entered into a marriage with parental consent, an arrangement that ended in divorce. By her early 20s, Judy was a single mother to two children, Christina and Daniel Hicks. Despite her circumstances, she was ambitious and charismatic, qualities that caught John's attention when she applied for a position with his sales team. Judy was determined to work for John's team, even though he wasn't actively hiring at the time. She convinced him that she had the drive and talent to excel in sales, and her persistence paid off. John decided to give her a chance, taking her under his wing as a trainee. Before long, their professional relationship blossomed into a romantic one. Judy wasn't just a salesperson. She became John's partner in both life and business. The two married and started building a life together. With their combined skills and determination, they established J&J Parker Industries, a thriving vacuum sales business. On the surface, they appeared to be the perfect example of a hardworking, successful couple. They blended their families, creating what seemed like a strong unit centered around their shared goals. April 17, 2003, began as an ordinary day in the Parker household. John and Judy were busy managing their successful vacuum sales business, J&J Parker Industries. Their children, Christina and Daniel, were growing up in what seemed like a stable, hardworking family. However, the facade of normalcy was about to shatter in the most devastating way. At 8:25 p.m., a chilling 911 call came from Judy Parker. Her voice was frantic as she reported a horrific incident. Her husband had been shot. She explained that John had been found in his car, parked in the garage of their home. The dispatcher stayed on the line as Judy's panic escalated, her words painting a grim picture of the scene she had just encountered. First responders arrived at the Parker home minutes later, greeted by a scene that would haunt them. Inside the garage, John was slumped over in the driver's seat of his car. The engine was off and there were no immediate signs of a struggle. However, the severity of his injuries was undeniable. John had been shot multiple times, and it was clear to the paramedics that he was beyond saving. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The family home quickly transformed into an active crime scene. Yellow tape went up around the property as investigators began piecing together what had happened. Detectives noted that the shooting appeared to have been deliberate, and their initial focus was on how the killer had entered the property without drawing attention. There were no signs of forced entry into the house or garage, suggesting that whoever had committed the crime might have had access to the property, or even been someone John knew. Judy, visibly shaken and distraught, told investigators she had heard nothing unusual before discovering John's body. She explained that she had gone to check on him after noticing he hadn't returned inside. Her account, though consistent, raised questions. The investigators couldn't overlook the fact that many homicides are committed by those closest to the victim. Judy's demeanor and statements would be scrutinized, even as they worked to determine if there were other potential suspects. News of John's death spread quickly through the local community. He was well known in his field, and his colleagues and employees were shocked to learn of his murder. Many described him as a driven and charismatic leader, someone who was respected and admired. As details of the incident began to emerge, speculation grew about who could have committed such a heinous act. The discovery of John Parker's murder was a stark turning point in the Parker family story. What had started as a seemingly ordinary evening ended with a tragic loss and an investigation that would uncover layers of secrets and betrayals. In the days following John Parker's murder, the investigation intensified. Detectives meticulously combed through the evidence collected at the crime scene, including the garage where John's lifeless body had been discovered. While the scene lacked signs of a struggle or forced entry, the nature of the shooting suggested premeditation. Whoever killed John had done so with precision, leaving little behind to directly implicate them. The autopsy confirmed John Parker had been shot 3 times. The entry wounds were consistent with bullets fired at close range, indicating the killer had been deliberate and intentional. Ballistic analysis identified the type of firearm used, but the murder weapon was nowhere to be found. This discovery added to the mystery, as it suggested the perpetrator had taken steps to conceal their involvement. Investigators began with those closest to John, starting with his wife, Judy. It's standard protocol in any murder case to examine family members, particularly a spouse, as potential suspects. While Judy's grief appeared genuine, detectives couldn't ignore certain elements of her account that raised questions. Why hadn't she heard the gunshots in the garage? How did the killer access the home without breaking in? Judy willingly cooperated with investigators, answering their questions and even agreeing to a search of the house. She recounted the events of the evening, emphasizing that she had no reason to believe John was in danger. However, detectives knew they needed more than her word. They pulled her phone records, financial documents, and recent communications, searching for anything that might hint at a motive or a connection to the crime. The police also turned their attention to John's business dealings. As the owner of J&J Parker Industries, John was a respected figure in his field, but his success may have created enemies. Could a disgruntled employee or competitor have been responsible? Investigators interviewed current and former employees, as well as business associates, hoping to uncover any conflicts or disputes that might point to a suspect. Meanwhile, Judy's past began to come under scrutiny. Investigators learned that she had a history that was anything but ordinary. By the time she met John, she had already been through a previous marriage and was raising 2 children, Christina and Daniel. This detail, while not inherently suspicious, added complexity to her background. Could something from her past have resurfaced and led to John's death? As detectives continued their inquiries, they received an unexpected lead. A neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the Parker home on the night of the murder. The car was described as a dark-colored sedan, and the witness claimed it had been idling near the driveway for several minutes. This lead offered investigators a potential clue about the killer's movements, but identifying the vehicle's owner proved difficult. While the investigation pressed forward, the community remained on edge. John Parker's murder had shattered the sense of safety in the neighborhood, and rumors swirled about who could be responsible. Friends and colleagues of John came forward to share their memories of him, painting a picture of a hard-working and determined man who had built a successful life for himself and his family. Despite the mounting pressure, weeks passed without any significant breakthroughs. Detectives were frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence, and the case seemed to be at a standstill. But just when it appeared the trail had gone cold, a new discovery emerged, one that would shift the entire direction of the investigation and reveal the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of the Parker family's life. The Parker investigation had stalled, with detectives struggling to piece together the puzzle of John's murder. But just as it seemed progress had ground to a halt, a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Investigators received a tip from a former colleague of Judy's, who claimed to have information about her past. This lead prompted detectives to dig deeper into Judy's life, specifically the years before she met John. What they uncovered surprised them. Judy's financial records showed she was under significant stress, carrying substantial debts. Additionally, she had taken out a life insurance policy on John for a significant sum. While the existence of such a policy wasn't unusual for a married couple, the timing raised eyebrows. It had been purchased only a few months before John's murder, and investigators couldn't ignore the possibility of financial motives. The detectives also re-examined Judy's behavior on the night of the murder. Her 911 call, while emotional, revealed inconsistencies. For example, when pressed about why she hadn't heard the gunshots, she said she had been inside with the television on at high volume. However, a neighbor told police they hadn't heard the TV, but did hear what they thought were raised voices earlier that evening. The investigation also revisited the dark sedan spotted near the Parker home on the night of the murder. After combing through traffic camera footage from the surrounding area, detectives managed to identify the vehicle. It was registered to a man named Daniel Hicks, Judy's son from her first marriage. The connection set off alarm bells for investigators, who immediately began looking into Daniel's activities around the time of the crime. Daniel, now in his mid-20s, had a history of minor run-ins with the law. While his offenses were non-violent, such as petty theft and trespassing, his name being linked to the case raised suspicion. Detectives tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. At first, Daniel denied any involvement, insisting he had been elsewhere on the night of the murder. But his alibi was flimsy, and his story began to crumble under scrutiny. When investigators searched Daniel's residence, they found an item that would become a key piece of evidence: a pair of gloves with traces of gunshot residue. This discovery was critical, as it tied Daniel to a firearm at some point close to the time of the murder. Additionally, a search of his phone records showed a series of calls to Judy in the hours leading up to John's death. This suggested not only that Daniel was involved, but that Judy might have been complicit. The case took a chilling turn when Daniel, under the weight of mounting evidence, admitted to being at the scene of the crime. However, he claimed the murder was not his idea. According to Daniel, Judy had convinced him to carry out the act, describing John as a controlling and abusive husband. She allegedly framed the murder as a necessary step to free herself and her children from John's grip. While Daniel's confession provided valuable insight, it also complicated the case. Judy's portrayal of John as an abusive figure didn't align with the testimony of his friends and colleagues, who described him as kind and devoted. This created a tangled web of accusations and motivations that investigators struggled to untangle. Despite Daniel's claims, Judy maintained her innocence. She insisted she had no knowledge of or involvement in the crime, painting herself as a victim of her son's actions. Her legal team argued that Daniel acted alone, driven by his own unresolved anger and misguided attempts to protect his mother. As detectives worked to build a case against both Judy and Daniel, the public became increasingly engrossed in the unfolding drama. News outlets covered every detail, painting the Parker family as a portrait of dysfunction and betrayal. But behind the headlines, one question loomed: was Judy truly the mastermind, or was she just another pawn in a much larger tragedy? The investigation into John Parker's murder culminated in charges being filed against Judy Parker and her son, Daniel Hicks. The prosecution painted a harrowing picture of greed and manipulation, alleging that Judy had orchestrated the killing to collect on John's life insurance policy and escape her mounting financial troubles. Daniel, they argued, had been the weapon she wielded to execute her plan. Judy and Daniel were charged separately but tried concurrently, with both trials drawing widespread public attention. Judy, who had maintained her innocence throughout the investigation, now faced the daunting task of defending herself in court. Daniel's defense was equally challenging, as his earlier confession tied him directly to the crime scene. The stakes were high, and the courtroom atmosphere was tense from the outset. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically, starting with the timeline of events on the night of the murder. They presented phone records showing a series of calls between Judy and Daniel in the hours leading up to John's death. These calls, they argued, were evidence of coordination and planning. The prosecution also introduced the pair of gloves found at Daniel's residence, which contained traces of gunshot residue. Combined with his confession, this evidence placed Daniel directly at the crime scene. For Judy, the most damaging evidence came in the form of her financial records. Prosecutors highlighted her substantial debts and pointed to the life insurance policy she had taken out on John as clear indicators of motive. They argued that Judy had manipulated her son into believing John was a threat, convincing him to carry out the murder in exchange for financial stability. The defense, however, presented a starkly different narrative. Judy's lawyers contended that she was a loving wife who had no knowledge of or involvement in her husband's murder. They claimed that Daniel acted independently, driven by his own emotions and unresolved issues with John. Judy's team also worked to discredit the notion that financial troubles were her primary motivation, arguing that her debts were manageable and that John had been supportive of her efforts to overcome them. Daniel's defense team attempted to shift the focus away from him, claiming that his confession had been coerced by investigators under intense pressure. They argued that while Daniel had been at the Parker home that night, he did not pull the trigger and had no intention of harming John. Instead, they suggested that Judy's portrayal of John as abusive had clouded Daniel's judgment, leading him to act out of misguided loyalty to his mother. As the trial progressed, emotional testimony from both sides added layers of complexity to the case. Friends and family members took the stand, offering conflicting accounts of John and Judy's relationship. While some described John as a devoted husband and father, others hinted at underlying tensions in the marriage. These accounts left the jury grappling with competing narratives, unsure of who to believe. One particularly gripping moment came when Daniel testified in his own defense. He recounted his version of events, claiming that Judy had begged him to help her and that he had only wanted to protect her from what she described as an abusive situation. His testimony was emotional and filled with contradictions, leaving the jury to question whether he was a victim of manipulation or an unreliable narrator attempting to save himself. Judy, on the other hand, chose not to take the stand, a decision her defense team said was to avoid further scrutiny of her character. This choice, however, left the prosecution free to emphasize her silence as indicative of guilt, further complicating the jury's deliberations. The courtroom proceedings were intense, with each side presenting compelling arguments and evidence. By the time closing statements were delivered, the jury faced the daunting task of untangling a web of lies, manipulation, and conflicting motivations. As the trial came to a close, the public remained captivated, eagerly awaiting the verdict. Would the jury find Judy and Daniel guilty, or would the cracks in the prosecution's case raise enough doubt to secure their acquittal? The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned to deliver their verdict. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and impassioned arguments, the weight of their decision was palpable. For Judy Parker and her son Daniel Hicks, the outcome would determine the rest of their lives. The judge, with an air of solemnity, asked the foreperson to announce the findings. The jury found Judy Parker guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and aiding and abetting. Daniel Hicks, in turn, was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom, with audible gasps from some spectators. While the prosecution had presented a strong case, the defense's attempt to cast doubt on Judy's involvement in the circumstances of Daniel's confession had left some uncertainty. However, the jury ultimately concluded that the evidence against them was overwhelming. Judy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a stark contrast to the life she had built with John, filled with aspirations and ambition. Daniel, despite his age and claims of coercion, also received a life sentence. The court's decision reflected the severity of the crime and its impact on the Parker family and community. In the weeks following the trial, public opinion remained divided. Some viewed Judy as the mastermind behind the crime, a manipulative figure who exploited her son's loyalty for personal gain. Others saw her as a desperate woman trapped in financial turmoil whose actions spiraled out of control. Daniel's role was equally contentious. Was he a cold-blooded killer or a young man misguided by his mother's influence? The Parker home, once a symbol of success and stability, became a grim reminder of the events that had unfolded. The vacuum cleaner business, which had been thriving under John's leadership, quickly dissolved. Without its driving force, the enterprise could not sustain itself, leaving employees and clients to grapple with the loss. John Parker's family struggled to make sense of what had happened. His brother, who had initially been among the most vocal in seeking justice, expressed a mix of relief and sorrow after the verdict. He publicly stated that while the convictions provided some closure, the loss of John and the betrayal by Judy and Daniel left scars that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, the case continued to garner attention, appearing in documentaries and true crime specials. Legal experts dissected the trial, debating whether Judy and Daniel had received fair representation. Advocacy groups raised questions about the use of life sentences for individuals like Daniel, who had been heavily influenced by an authority figure in his life. Despite the media coverage and ongoing discussions, Judy and Daniel themselves largely disappeared from public view. In interviews conducted after her conviction, Judy maintained her innocence, insisting that she had never conspired to kill John. Daniel, on the other hand, expressed regret, but stopped short of fully admitting his guilt. hinting at the complexities of his relationship with his mother. The Parker case remains a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of manipulation, greed, and fractured family dynamics. It underscores the vulnerability of even the most seemingly successful families to unravel under the weight of hidden tensions and unresolved conflicts. For those closest to John, the memory of his life remains overshadowed by the tragedy of his death. Yet in their quiet moments, they cling to the hope that sharing his story might serve as a lesson for others, a reminder of the importance of trust, honesty, and accountability in all relationships. As the final chapter of this story closed, it left a lingering sense of unease, a testament to the chilling reality of betrayal and its far-reaching consequences. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to be notified as we upload new crime stories daily. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.